We're visiting today with Dr. Gary Moncrief, Distinguished Professor at Boise State University. He's been on the faculty at Boise State for more than 30 years. He is a frequent contributor to a number of media outlets on legislative and election-related issues. He's also the author of State Legislatures Today, Politics Under the Domes, along with other numerous publications. And Gary, the basic question is, from state to state, why are state legislatures so different from each other?
Well, I think it stems originally from the constitutions of the states are a bit different, and the way that the legislatures were constructed is a bit different. But a lot of it has to do with change over time as well, that particularly the states that have a lot of population have developed a different style of legislature, one that tends to meet a much longer period of time, for example. So there's a lot of things that have gone into that over time, and there's really no rhyme or reason to the way some of them look, but they're very different one from another, and I think that's one of the things that's most interesting about state politics.
And do the respective states look at what other states are doing and how they approach it?
Yeah, I think they do, mostly on the policy side more than the structure. I mean, once the state legislature has a structure, it tends not to change very rapidly. I mean, over the course of a century it'll change, but those changes tend to be fairly slow. So you have some states that have very large legislatures. New Hampshire, for example, has 400 members of the state legislature in the House of Representatives, which is quite unbelievable given the size of the population there. Whereas California, which has a much larger population, only has 80 people in the Assembly, which is what they call their House of Representatives there.
I would assume that party politics plays a significant role in this as well.
Party politics are always relevant. There's one state that actually is nonpartisan, and that's Nebraska. You know, everybody knows Nebraska for its unicameral legislature. That is, they don't have a House and Senate, they just have a Senate. But it's also a nonpartisan institution. That is, people don't run for the Nebraska unicameral with a Republican or Democratic affiliation to their name. So Nebraska is a bit unusual in that regard. But in terms of partisan makeup, it's very different from one state to another. You have some states like our home state of Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, Kansas, which tend to be very Republican. And then you have some states that are very Democratic. In Hawaii right now, I think there's 25 Democrats and 1 Republican in the Hawaii Senate, for example. And Massachusetts and Rhode Island tend to be heavily Democratic. And then there are some states where it's very competitive between the two parties and within each chamber. So it's a quite different situation from one state to another.
Does the age of a state factor into this? I mean, the original 13 colonies and those states that have been doing this in some form or fashion for centuries versus the western states, which are relatively new?
Well, the age of the state matters mostly in terms of the size of the chamber. That is, most of the eastern states, most of the original 13 colony states, tend to have very large state legislatures. And it goes back to the promise in those days of a representative system. People were very enthusiastic about representative democracy, and so they tended to have very large legislatures. Whereas in the West, the legislatures are much smaller in terms of chamber size. As I mentioned before, California only has 80 members of the Assembly and 40 in the Senate, you know, but has by far the largest population in the United States. So there's no correlation between the population of a state and the size of the legislature, but you're quite right. The older legislatures tend to be larger.
The size of the chamber is kind of an interesting dynamic. Yeah. Are those things in flux, or things that change over time, or are they pretty standard?
They don't change very much. Once that's set in the Constitution, it tends not to change very often, largely because it's difficult to change constitutions. And also, once you've built a state capitol with just room for 100 seats in it, it's hard to change that without tearing out the walls. And people aren't willing to do that very often. So the size of the chambers is usually fairly well set over time. And that does have a lot of implications in terms of the way the chamber operates. I mean, the larger the legislature, the more difficult it is for individuals to have much latitude. Leadership is going to have to control the situation much more, just because you have so many people involved. So the organizational structure changes given the size of the legislature.
Do budgets become an issue in some of the states where the chambers are larger?
Well, I don't think they become a huge issue, largely because most of those states with really large legislatures, like New Hampshire, tend to have very low pay for the legislators. In New Hampshire, they're paid $200. So that's not going to eat up the budget very much, even though there's 400 of them in the House.
Are there regional patterns to the makeup of the various bodies and the way they go about their business?
Yeah, there are some regional patterns, mostly having to do with the demographics of the state and the culture of the state, the political culture. For example, when you're talking about the number of women serving in state legislatures, there tend to be fewer women overall serving in state legislatures in the southern states, and I think that's largely a regional cultural component over time, although that's changing a bit. Whereas the western states have always had a lot of women serving in the legislatures, and up to 35 or 40% in many cases. So big differences. Again, one of the things that I think is most interesting about state legislatures is they really are different one from another. I mean, every state has one governor. Every state has a state Supreme Court. But when you're talking about state legislatures, while every state has one, what they look like is very different one from another.
What are some of the most significant changes that have taken place in state legislatures over the last generation or so?
Well, a couple of changes. One is that there was an effort, particularly in the 1970s, to essentially upgrade state legislatures, to make them more independent of the executive branch, to make them an independent force in policymaking. And so in a lot of states, we went through a process of increasing the number of staff in the state legislature, for example, increasing the pay of state legislators to attract a different group of people in, and expanding the time that they actually were in session. It used to be, back in the 50s and 60s, that a lot of states met every other year, and they met for only a couple of months. And that made it difficult for them to develop the kind of information to be able to make independent policy decisions. They were very reliant, for the most part, on the executive branch and often on interest groups as well. So one of the changes that occurred during that period was to try to strengthen state legislatures in terms of their organizational capacity. The other big change, I would argue, well, two big changes. One is the demographics have changed. There's so many more women, there's so many more people from minority demographic groups, Hispanics, African Americans, et cetera, than you used to see. And the other change is term limits in a number of states. There are now 15 states that limit the amount of time that someone can spend in office in the legislature, and that's had a very dramatic change in some of those states.
Is that a movement that's likely to continue forward more toward term limits? Or
no,
not?
I think it's run its course. As I mentioned, there's 15 states right now that have term limits. There were originally 21 states that passed term limits. Several of those were struck down by the state Supreme Courts. A couple of them were repealed by the state legislatures. So bottom line is, in the last few years, it's been that number at 15 has remained pretty stable. And it's not likely to change. I don't think we're going to see very many states actually do away with term limits. We may see a few that expand the length of the term. But, and the reality is, almost all the states that actually do have term limits got them through the initiative process. The initiative process only exists in about 23, 24 states. So most of the states that have the initiative process pass term limits. States without the initiative process did not pass term limits. And of course what that means is it's a form of direct democracy, which means you gather signatures on a petition, and if you get enough signatures, you can get an issue put on the ballot and the public votes on it. Well, that process, that initiative process, this direct democracy process, does not exist in all states. It is very prevalent in the western states. So a lot of western states pass term limits.
One of those regional patterns we were talking about.
Exactly, that's right, exactly.
Gary, maybe more so than ever lately, it seems like government in general, legislatures in particular, are extremely unpopular.
Yeah.
A lot of criticism of those. Why is it that legislatures are, by and large, viewed in such a fashion?
My good friend Alan Rosenthal at Rutgers says that they're unpopular because they're democracy in action, and democracy is a messy process. And I think that's really true. Everybody is in favor of democracy in theory, but watching it work, where people disagree with one another and where there's conflict, that's hard for people to get their arms around sometimes. So it is a difficult process that is indeed messy. It's not efficient by any stretch of the imagination. It takes a long time to get things done. There are multiple views on an issue that have to be processed and discussed and dealt with. So, legislatures are often viewed with a kind of jaundiced eye by people, I think. But I think they're also very necessary. The other part of that is that most people like their individual legislators. They just don't like the other legislators that are in the chamber. And that has a lot to do with the electoral system in the United States, where we vote for one or two people, and so we have a stronger connection to those people than to others.
And that popularity question, I think, ties into something you brought up earlier too, which is it's low pay. So you combine low pay with the fact that in many respects it's a thankless job. Why would anybody do it, and how do you then get qualified people on board to represent the populace?
Yeah, that's always a difficult issue. First of all, we should point out that they're not all low paid. There are some states in which the legislators are paid quite well. In California, the base salary is $99,000 per year. It's a full-time legislature, obviously, a big state with 37 million people, so they have lots of problems to deal with. In Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, these are legislatures that are paid pretty well. But for the most part, most state legislatures and the legislators serving in them are paid $10,000, $15,000 a year. I think the median income right now is something on the order of $17,000. So much less than I think what the general public thinks. So yeah, it's difficult sometimes to get people to run for office, particularly for legislative office. It takes a lot of time. They're not paid very well, and they're subject to being harassed by an individual sometimes.
Have we seen recently, with the unpopularity of public policy and a bad economy and people, I think, fed up with anybody that has anything to do with government, have we seen more people getting into the pool of candidates, or more qualified people getting in?
No, actually, I would argue we're actually seeing fewer. I think because it's a difficult job, and part of this has to do with the onerous nature of campaigning. Running for office is a difficult thing to do. I'm not sure most people understand just how hard that is on a personal level. I mean, you're putting your name out there, and you're asking people, essentially to judge you. That is, to vote for you or vote against you. And psychologically and emotionally, that's a hard thing to do. And it's also takes a lot of time. It's time-consuming. It's costly in most places now to run. Even for state legislative office, it's going to run, $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 to run for office, and in some states much more than that. And so it's, you're asking a lot of people to run for office, and if they view the job as one in which people are not going to appreciate them, it's hard to get people to do it.
And the mudslinging that has become a part of campaigning certainly has to be a deterrent.
That's right, and the campaign finance component is a subject unto itself. That's become even more complicated in the last few years because of the interpretation of the U.S. Supreme Court about who can get involved in this and what's known as independent spending. That's campaigns essentially being run by somebody other than the candidate. And so in many cases, the candidates have kind of lost control over the campaign process, and that's really a somewhat different topic altogether, but it is another reason why I think it's difficult to get people to run.
A hot button topic of late has been redistricting.
Right.
How does that factor into the effectiveness or the popularity of a legislature?
Well, there's a couple of things I think we need to make clear when we're talking about this subject. First of all, people tend to use the term reapportionment and redistricting interchangeably, and they're not really the same thing. Reapportionment means reallocating the seats among the states in the U.S. House of Representatives. So you are apportioning, that is, divvying up the number of seats on the basis of population. And so what happens every 10 years when the new census comes out is some states are going to get allocated another 1 or 2 additional representatives, and because the number of seats is fixed at 435, that means some other states are going to lose a representative. So it's a zero-sum game, and that is truly about apportioning seats within that chamber. What state legislatures tend to be about is redistricting, which is just drawing the lines so that you have the same number of people in each district. That again comes about because of the census and the shift in population, but it's a very difficult thing to do. More difficult in some states than others because of the geography of the state, because of the demographics of the state. But it's never an easy process, and it's always a political process. Because you are essentially determining who's going to represent what population, and voters in different areas have different party affiliation, and so it can change the dynamics of not only who's going to get elected, but which party is preferred in any given election. So there's a lot at stake in redistricting. And it's a complex thing.
Yeah, it's highly political, as you noted, and it's really difficult, I think, to find any kind of neutral party that could oversee that process.
Yeah. Now there are a number of states now, a dozen or 15 states, depending how you want to count them, that actually have redistricting commissions. That is, they've taken the process away from the legislature and have an independent commission. These are people who are not sitting legislators, and in most cases are banned from running for the legislature for a specified period of time. So that what you're really doing here is trying to take some of the self-interest and conflict of interest out of the system by taking this process away from the legislature itself. That doesn't mean it still isn't political. It's always political because it has political implications, the way the lines get drawn. So it can still be both political and sometimes, frankly, quite partisan, even with a commission. But the self-interest aspect of it is muted by having a commission do it. And commissions have become fairly popular. As I say, there's about a dozen to 15 states that now use them. Almost all of those are states that have instituted commissions just within the last 20 years or so.
And this all seems to be particularly interesting and relevant right now, state legislatures we're talking about, because I think the trend is toward less power for the federal government, and more swinging back, the pendulum swinging back to more power for state governments.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Federalism is a very complicated relationship, and we go through periods where it's more of a nation-centered federalism, and then periods where it's more of a state-centered federalism. And clearly, over the course of the last century, the national government has been in the ascendancy. It has gained much more control than it had prior to that. There are some good reasons for that in many instances. That's exactly what happened. Now, in the 1990s, we were actually seeing a period there, and actually I'd go back to the 80s when the Reagan administration, we were seeing an effort to roll back that relationship so that states were regaining some of that power that they had had before. And this is a period that became known as devolution. We were kind of devolving the power back to the original holders of that power, which were the states. We got sidetracked on that process, largely because of 9/11 and national security issues and the ascendancy again of the federal government. But given the economic situation today, and given, frankly, the philosophy of a number of people today, I think we are likely to see states become more important in this partnership than they have been in some time, and that means state legislatures become more important over time.
Has this been largely cyclical through history?
Well, it does tend to wax and wane, but I mean, historically, if you go back to to 1790 or so and track what's happened from there to today, there's little doubt that the national government is overall much stronger than it was in 1790. But yeah, we go through periods where the national government's power tends to extend much more rapidly than state power, and then it slides back a bit. And we're clearly, I think, in one of those periods.
What would be some of the pros and cons of each, or how they differ in the way they approach governance?
Well, I think most people would argue that the advantage of having states maintain most of the policy control is that the states are closer to the people. And therefore, people in different states that hold different values and ideologies and cultures, that can be applied more at the state level, state by state. On the other hand, there are certain guaranteed rights that we have as citizens of the United States, and it's a situation where you want the national government to have control over protecting those rights. And of course, the key thing here is, in many ways, the 14th Amendment. And you know, so often states' rights has been associated in the past with some of the kind of uglier periods of American history. And you know, hopefully we're past that largely today, and so states' rights won't have quite the same meaning it had in the past.
Dr. Gary Moncrief, Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Boise State University. Gary, thank you very much for your insight and expertise.
My pleasure.